Good evening. This is The Haunting of Hill House, Chapter 6. I am learning the pathways of the heart, Eleanor thought quite seriously, and then wondered what she could have meant by thinking any such thing. It was afternoon, and she sat in the sunlight on the steps of the summer house beside Luke. These are the silent pathways of the heart, she thought. She knew that she was pale and still shaken, with dark circles under her eyes, but the sun was warm and the leaves moved gently overhead, and Luke beside her lay lazily against the step. "Luke," she asked, going slowly for fear of ridicule, "why do people want to talk to each other? I mean, what are things people always want to find out about other people?" "What do you want to know about me, for instance?" He laughed. She thought, but why not ask what he wants to know about me? He's so extremely vain. And laughed in turn and said, "What can I ever know about you beyond what I see?" See was the least of the words she might have chosen, but the safest. Tell me something that only I will ever know, was perhaps what she wanted to ask him. Or, what will you give me to remember you by? Or even, nothing of the least importance has ever belonged to me. Can you help? Then she wondered if she had been foolish, or bold, amazed at her own thoughts. But he only stared down at the leaf he held in his hands and frowned a little, as one who devotes himself completely to an absorbing problem. He's trying to phrase everything to make as good an impression as possible, she thought, and I will know how he holds me by what he answers. How is he anxious to appear to me? Does he think that I will be content with small mysticism? Or will he exert himself to seem unique? Is he going to be gallant? That would be humiliating, because then you would show that he knows that gallantry enchants me. Will he be mysterious? Mad? And how am I to receive this, which I perceive already will be a confidence, even if it's not true? Grant that Luke take me at my word, she thought, or at least let me not see the difference. Let him be wise, or let me be blind. Don't let me, she hoped concretely, don't let me know too surely what he thinks of me. Then he looked at her briefly and smiled, what she was coming to know as his self-deprecatory smile. Did Theodora, she wondered, and the thought was unwelcome, did Theodora know him as well as this? "I never had a mother," he said, and the shock was enormous. Is that all he thinks of me? His estimate of what I want to hear of him? Will I enlarge this into a confidence, making me worthy of great confidences? Shall I sigh, murmur, walk away? "No one ever loved me because I belonged," he said. "I suppose you can understand that." No, she thought. You are not going to catch me so cheaply. I do not understand words, and I will not accept them in trade for my feelings. This man is a parrot. I will tell him that I can never understand such a thing, that maudlin self-pity does not move directly at my heart. I will not make a fool of myself by encouraging him to mock me. "I understand, yes," she said. "I thought you might," he said, and she wanted quite honestly to slap his face. "I think you must be a very fine person, Nell," he said, and then spoiled it by adding, "warm-hearted and honest. Afterwards, when you go home—" His voice trailed off, and she thought, either he's beginning to tell me something extremely important, or he's killing time until this conversation can gracefully be ended. He would not speak in this fashion without a reason. He does not willingly give himself away. Does he think that a human gesture of affection might seduce me into hurling myself madly at him? Is he afraid that I cannot behave like a lady? What does he know about me, about how I think and feel? Does he feel sorry for me? "Journeys end in lovers' meeting," she said. "Yes," he said. "I never had a mother, as I told you. Now I find that everyone else has had something that I missed." He smiled at her. "I'm entirely selfish," he said ruefully, "and always hoping that someone will tell me to behave. Someone will make herself responsible for me and make me be grown up." He is altogether selfish, she thought in some surprise. The only man I've ever sat and talked to alone, and I'm impatient. He is simply not very interesting. Why don't you grow up by yourself? She asked him, and wondered how many women, had already asked him that. You're clever. And how many times had he answered that way? This conversation must be largely instinctive, she thought with amusement, and said gently, You must be a very lonely person. All I want is to be cherished, she thought. And here I am talking gibberish with a selfish man. You must be very lonely indeed. He touched her hand and smiled again. You were so lucky, he told her. You had a mother. Part 2. I found it in the library, Luke said. I swear I found it in the library. Incredible, the doctor said. Look, Luke said. He set the great book on the table, turned to the title page. He made it himself. Look, the title's been lettered in ink. Memories for Sophia Ann Lester Crane. A legacy for her education and enlightenment during her lifetime from her affectionate and devoted father, Hugh Desmond Lester Crane, 21st June, 1881. They pressed around the table, Theodora and Eleanor and the doctor, while Luke lifted and turned the first great page of the book. You see, Luke said, his little girl is to learn humility. He has clearly cut up a number of fine old books to make this scrapbook, because I seem to recognize several of the pictures, and they are all glued in. The vanity of human accomplishment, the doctor said, sadly. Think of the books Hugh Crane hacked apart to make this. Now here is a Goya etching, a horrible thing for a little girl to meditate upon. Underneath he has written, Luke said, under this ugly picture, Honor thy father and thy mother, daughter, authors of thy being, upon whom a heavy charge has been laid, that they lead their child in innocence and righteousness along the fearful narrow path to everlasting bliss, and render her up at last to her God, a pious and virtuous soul. Reflect, daughter, upon the joy in heaven as the souls of these tiny creatures wing upward, released before they have learned aught of sin or faithlessness, and make it thine unceasing duty to remain as pure as these. Poor baby, Eleanor said, and gasped as Luke turned the page. Hugh Crane's second moral lesson derived from a color plate of a snake pit, and vividly painted snakes writhed and twisted along the page, above the message neatly printed, and touched with gold. Eternal damnation is the lot of mankind. Neither tears nor reparation can undo man's heritage of sin. Daughter, hold apart from this world, that its lusts and ingratitudes corrupt thee not. Daughter, preserve thyself. Next comes hell, Luke said. Don't look if you're squeamish. I think I will skip hell, Eleanor said, but read it to me. Wise of you, the doctor said. An illustration from Fox, one of the less attractive deaths, I have always thought, although who can fathom the ways of martyrs? See this, though, Luke said. He's burnt away a corner of the page, and here's what he says. Daughter, could you but hear for a moment the agony, the screaming, the dreadful crying out in repentance of those poor souls condemned to everlasting flame. Could thine eyes be seared but for an instant with the red glare of wasteland burning always? Alas, wretched beings, in undying pain. Daughter, your father has this minute touched the corner of this page to his candle and seen the frail paper shrivel and curl in the flame. Consider, daughter, that the heat of this candle is to the everlasting fires of hell as a grain of sand to the reaching desert. And as this paper burns in its slight flame, so shall your soul burn forever in fire 1,000-fold more keen. I'll bet he read it to her every night before she went to sleep, Theodora said. Wait, Luke said. You haven't seen heaven yet. Even you can look at this one now. It's Blake, and a bit stern. I think, but obviously better than hell. Listen. Holy, holy, holy. In the pure light of heaven, the angels praise him, and one another unendingly. Daughter, it is here that I will seek thee. What a labor of love it is, the doctor said. Hours of time just planning it, and the lettering is so dainty, and the guilt. Now the 7 deadly sins, Luke said, and I think the old boy drew them himself. He really did put his heart into gluttony, Theodora said. I'm not sure I'll ever be hungry again. Wait till lust, Luke told her. The old fellow outdid himself. I don't really think I want to look at it anymore, I think, Theodora said. I'll sit over here with Nell, and if you come across any particularly edifying moral precepts you think would do me good, read them aloud. Here is lust, Luke said. Was ever woman in this humor wooed? Good heavens, said the doctor. Good heavens. He must have drawn it himself, Luke said. For a child? The doctor was outraged. Her very own scrapbook. Note pride, the very image of our Nell here. What? Said Eleanor, starting up. Teasing, the doctor said placatingly. Don't come look, my dear, he's teasing you. Sloth now, Luke said. Envy, said the doctor. How the poor child dared transgress. The last page is the very nicest, I think. This, ladies, is Hugh Crane's blood. Nell, do you want to see Hugh Crane's blood? No, thank you. Theo? No? In any case, I insist, for the sake of your 2 consciences, in reading what Hugh Crane has to say in closing his book. Daughter, sacred pacts are signed in blood, and I have here taken from my own wrist the vital fluid which I bind you. Live virtuously, be meek, have faith in thy Redeemer, and in me thy Father, and I swear to thee that we will be joined together hereafter in unending bliss. Accept these precepts from thy devoted Father, who in humbleness of spirit has made this book. May it serve its purpose well, my feeble effort, and preserve my child from the pitfalls of this world and bring her safe to her Father's arms in heaven. And signed, thy ever-loving Father in this world and the next, author of thy being and guardian of thy virtue, in meekest love, Hugh Crane. Theodora shuddered. How he must have enjoyed it, she said, signing his name in his own blood. I can see him laughing his head off. Not healthy, not at all a healthy work for a man, the doctor said. But she must have been very small when her father left the house, Eleanor said. I wonder if he ever did read it to her. I'm sure he did. Leaning over her candle, spitting out the words so they could take root in her little mind. Hugh Crane, Theodora said. You were a dirty old man, and you made a dirty old house. If you could still hear me from anywhere, I would like to tell you to your face that I genuinely hope you will spend eternity in that foul, horrible picture and never stop burning for a minute. She made a wild, derisive gesture around the room, and for a minute, still remembering, they were all quite silent, as though waiting for an answer. And then the coals in the fire fell with a little crash. The doctor looked at his watch, and Luke rose. The sun is over the yardarm, the doctor said happily. Part 3. Theodora curled by the fire, looking up wickedly at Eleanor. At the other end of the room, the chessmen moved softly, jarring with little sounds against the table, and Theodora spoke gently, tormentingly. Will you have him at your little apartment now, and offer him to drink from your cup of stars? Eleanor looked into the fire, not answering. I've been so silly, she thought. I've been a fool. Is there room enough for 2? Will he come if you asked him? Nothing could be worse than this, Eleanor thought. I've been a fool. Perhaps he's been longing for a tiny home, something smaller, of course, than Hill House. Perhaps he'll come home with you. A fool. A ludicrous fool. Your white curtains, your tiny stone lions. Eleanor looked down at her almost gently. But I had to come, she said, and stood up, turning blindly to get away. Not hearing the startled voices behind her, not seeing where or how she went, she blundered somehow to the great front door and out into the soft, warm night. I had to come, she said to the world outside. Fear and guilt are sisters. Theodora caught her on the lawn. Silent, angry, hurt, they left Hill House side by side, walking together, each sorry for the other. A person angry or laughing or terrified or jealous will go stubbornly on into extremes of behavior impossible at any other time. Neither Eleanor nor Theodora reflected for a minute that it was imprudent for them to walk far from Hill House after dark. Each was so bent upon her own despair that escape into darkness was vital, and containing themselves in that tight, vulnerable, impossible cloak, which is fury, they stamped along together, each achingly aware of each other, each determined to be the last to speak. Eleanor spoke first, finally. She'd hurt her foot against a rock, and tried to be too proud to notice it, but after a minute, her foot paining, she said, in a voice tight with any attempt to sound level, I can't imagine why you'd think you have any right to interfere in my affairs. Her language formal to prevent a flood of recrimination or undeserved reproach. Were they not strangers? Cousins? I'm sure that nothing I do is of any interest to you. That's right, Theodora said grimly. Nothing that you do is of any interest to me. We're walking on either side of a fence, Eleanor thought. But I have a right to live too, and I wasted an hour with Luke at the summer house trying to prove it. I hurt my foot, she said. I'm sorry. Theodora sounded genuinely grieved. You know what a beast he is, she hesitated. A rake. She finally, with a touch of amusement, said, I'm sure it's nothing to me what he is. And then, because they were women quarreling, as if you cared anyways. He shouldn't be allowed to get away with it, Theodora said. Get away with what? Eleanor asked daintily. You're making a fool of yourself, Theodora said. Suppose I'm not, though. You'd mind terribly if you turned out to be the wrong this time, wouldn't you? Theodora's voice was wearied, cynical. If I'm wrong, she said, I will bless you with all my heart, fool that you are. You could hardly say anything else. They were moving along the path toward the brook. In the darkness, their feet felt that they were going downhill, and each privately and perversely accused the other of taking, deliberately, a path that they had followed together once before in happiness. Anyway, Eleanor said in a reasonable tone, it doesn't mean anything to you, no matter what happens. Why should you care whether I make a fool of myself? Theodora was silent for a minute, walking in the darkness, and Eleanor was suddenly absurdly sure that Theodora had put out a hand to her unseen. Theo, Eleanor said awkwardly, I'm no good at talking to people and saying things. Theodora laughed. What are you good at? She demanded. Running away? Nothing irrevocable had yet been spoken, but there was only the barest margin of safety left then. Each of them moving delicately along the outskirts of an open question, and once spoken, such a question as, Do you love me? Could never be answered or forgotten. They walked slowly, meditating, wondering, and the path sloped down from their feet, and they followed, walking side by side in the most extreme intimacy of expectation, their fainting and hesitation done with. They could only wait passively for resolution. Each knew, almost within a breath, what the other was thinking and wanted to say. Each of them almost wept for each other. They perceived at the same moment the change in the path, and each knew then the other's knowledge of it. Theodora took Eleanor's arm, and afraid to stop, they moved on slowly, close together, and ahead of them their path widened and blackened and curved. Eleanor caught her breath, and Theodora's hand tightened, warning her to be quiet. On either side of them the trees, silent, relinquished the dark color that they had held, paled, grew transparent, and stood white and ghastly against the black sky. The grass was colorless, the path wide and black, There was nothing else. Eleanor's teeth were chattering, and the nausea of fear almost doubled her. Her arm shivered under Theodora's holding hand, now almost a clutch, and she felt every slow step as a willed act, a precise mad insistence upon the putting of one foot down after the other as the only sane choice. Her eyes hurt with tears against the screaming blackness of the path and the shuddering whiteness of the trees, and she thought with a clear, intelligent picture of the words in her mind, burning, "Now I am really afraid." They moved on, the path unrolling ahead of them, the white trees unchanging on either side, and above all, the black sky lying thick overhead. Their feet were shimmering white where they touched the path. Theodora's hand was pale and luminous. Ahead of them, the path curved out of sight, and they walked slowly on, moving their feet precisely because it was the only physical act possible to them, the only thing left to keep them from sinking into the awful blackness and whiteness and luminous evil glow. "Now I am really afraid," Eleanor thought in words of fire. Remotely, she could still feel Theodora's hand on her arm, but Theodora was distant, locked away. It was bitterly cold, with no human warmth near. "Now I am really afraid," Eleanor thought, and put her feet forward one after another, shivering as they touched the path, shivering with mindless cold. The path unwound. Perhaps it was taking them somewhere, willfully, since neither of them could step off it and go knowingly into the annihilation of whiteness that was the grass on either side. The path curved, black and shining, and they followed. Theodora's hand tightened, and Eleanor caught her breath on a little sob. Had something moved ahead? Something whiter than the white trees? Beckoning? Beckoning, fading into the trees, watching? Was there movement beside them? Imperceptible in the soundless night? Did some footstep go invisibly along with them in the white grass? Where were they? The path led them to its destined end and died beneath their feet. Eleanor and Theodora looked into a garden, their eyes blinded with the light of sun and rich color. Incredibly, there was a picnic party on the grass in the garden. They could hear the laughter of the children and the affectionate, amused voices of the mother and father. The grass was richly, thickly green. The flowers were colored red and orange and yellow. The sky was blue and gold, and one child wore a scarlet jumper and raised its voice again in laughter, rumbling after a puppy over the grass. There was a checked tablecloth spread out, and smiling, the mother leaned over to take up a plate of bright fruit. Then Theodora screamed. "Don't look back!" she cried out in a voice high with fear. "Don't look back! Don't look! Run!" Running without knowing why she ran, Eleanor thought that she would catch her foot in the checked tablecloth. She was afraid she might stumble over the puppy, but as they ran across the garden there was nothing except weeds growing blackly in the darkness, and Theodora, screaming still, trampled over the bushes where there had been flowers and stumbled, sobbing, over half-buried stones, what might have been a broken cup. Then they were beating and scratching wildly at the white stone wall where the vines grew blackly, screaming still and begging to be let out, until the rusted iron gate gave way, and they ran, crying and gasping and somehow holding hands, across the kitchen garden of Hill House, and crashed through a back door into the kitchen to see Luke and the doctor hurrying to them. "What happened?" Luke said, catching at Theodora. "You all right?" "We've been nearly crazy," the doctor said, worn. "We've been out looking for you for hours." "It was a picnic," Eleanor said. She'd fallen into a kitchen chair and was looking down at her hands, scratched and bleeding and shaking without her knowledge. "We tried to get out," she told them, holding her hands out for them to see. "It was a picnic. The children—" Theodora laughed a little in a continuing cry, laughing on and on thinly, and said through her laughter, "I looked back. I went and looked behind us." They laughed on. "The children and a puppy." "Eleanor!" Theodora turned wildly and put her head against Eleanor. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor." And holding Theodora, Eleanor looked up at Luke and the doctor and felt the room rock madly, and time, as she has always known it, stop. End of chapter 6. Thank you for listening.